Hello again, and thank you for sticking around for my second talk. This talk is going to focus on habitat use and resource selection by the bighorn sheep in the San Andres Mountains. And as I previously mentioned in my other talk, these mountains do represent a really vital resource for the bighorn sheep. They represent one of the largest relatively undisturbed Chihuahuan desert land masses in the U.S. However, their vast range, they extend nearly 75 miles from north to south, does create a challenge for managers trying to monitor the population's abundance within the region. To help with this and to identify areas that are frequently used by bighorn in order to conserve time and resources during aerial surveys, in late 2017, early 2018, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and captured and collared 13 bighorn from the region. And they captured 10 ewes and 3 rams. And these collars have since transmitted a single location each day at noon. And I'll just give a brief summary of what data has been collected. So since these collars were implemented, they have collected over 9,500 locations, with a little over a third of them being taken within the refuge. And as of this week, 3 of the collars are still transmitting locations, but unfortunately last week we did have another mortality event with one of the ewes. And the goal of this part of my project was to just first identify what habitat these animals were using, so just simply to plot those GPS locations onto a map. And then I compared habitat use between ewes and rams and across the different breeding seasons, so breeding, rut, and pre-rut and post-rut. And then I also determined resource selection using a resource selection function model. And I'll kind of briefly talk about each of these different objectives today. To give you an idea of where these bighorn are on the landscape, first I generated home ranges for each of these individuals, and I used the home range tool in ArcGIS to determine their home range. This tool creates a polygon that contains either 50, 90, or 95% of all locations, and the largest of these polygons, the 95%, the one that contains 95% of all locations, represents the animal's home range. So this map here is a bit busy, but it shows all the home ranges of each of these 13 sheep and how they overlap. So just maybe you can see a bit better on this map over here. You have the pink home range of this sheep, and the dots represent those individual locations. And the average home range size was about 15,000 hectare, give or take, which is quite large. And all but 4 of these sheep do have home ranges that intersect the boundaries of the refuge. So the refuge boundaries are shown in blue here. You can see that there are 2 ewes that sort of always range kind of north to the boundaries, and there are 2 ewes down here in this clump of a lot of ewes that always range to the southern border of the refuge. And I wanted to start just by giving you an idea of how these ranges compared between ewes and rams. So here we did not find any significant difference in the home range size between the rams and ewes, though rams did have on average slightly larger home range size, which is consistent with other studies. Just to see where these kind of ranges fall on the landscape, we see that the 3 collared rams always range sort of in the southern area of the mountains, where a few of the ewes actually ventured a little bit more north. You can see that pretty well in this map over here. And what's really interesting is these 2 ewes with like the most northern ranges really had quite large home range sizes when compared to all the other ewes. Not exactly sure why that might be. Perhaps there's limited resources there, so they're moving a lot more to find what they need to meet their energy requirements, but more is kind of needed to know what's actually going on with those 2 ewes that seem to venture to have pretty large home ranges. We also wanted to see how habitat use differed between sex and season based on different habitat characteristics. So many of these are pretty standard measurements, and we calculated them all in ArcGIS, but just to summarize, we looked at percent slope, elevation, vector ruggedness measure, or your terrain ruggedness. We looked at the curvature of the slope. We also measured distance from escape terrain, which here was areas of habitat that were greater than 1 hectare that had a percent slope greater than 60. And we also looked at distance from grassland, shrubland, and woodland based on some vegetation data that we had. Also looked at distance to disturbance. In this case, disturbance is usually roads or military disturbance. And then we also looked at distance to what we considered active springs, though our spring data set is a little bit old and could use some updating. So when we compare habitat use between sex, we found that ewes on average use areas with a steeper slope than do rams. We also see that ewes tend to stay closer to escape terrain than rams, and they also tend to stay closer to grasslands than rams. So just to summarize, ewes tend to use areas that are close to escape terrain and grasslands that have pretty steep slopes, and this may be because of their need to avoid predators more than you might expect of rams. And next we looked at how habitat use differs across seasons. So here we see that during the rut season, these sheep, no matter what their sex is, tend to use less steep slopes. They also tend to use less rugged terrain, and we see them move away from escape terrain. So just to summarize again, during rut, bighorn tended to use less rugged and less steep terrain. They move away from escape terrain, which may suggest that they're sort of preoccupied with breeding at this time. Now I'll briefly conclude what we saw when we compared these habitat characteristics between season and sex, and then I'll move on to the rest of my talk. But I do want to start by saying these data do only represent what habitat these animals are using at midday when they are likely resting. And even at that, we still do see some differences between ewes and rams. Overall, though, they tend to use pretty similar habitats regardless of sex. Of all the different characteristics we looked at, only 3 were significantly different between ewes and rams, and that was, distance to escape terrain, distance to grassland, and overall slope. So we see that ewes are using these steep areas close to escape terrain and grassland, even in midday when it's generally thought that predator pressure is pretty low. And this suggests that areas that offer protection from predators may be more important for ewes than are for rams. And these bighorn also display some shifts in habitat use depending on the season. And during rut, these bighorn move away from escape terrain to areas that are less rugged and steep, and that suggests that breeding does influence how these bighorn use their habitat. It's pretty interesting that we see such big shifts, during the breeding season, and we didn't really see any major shifts during the lambing season, which is pretty interesting and maybe something that we'll spend a little bit more time sort of parsing out. So we also developed a resource selection function model to compare the habitat that is selected by bighorn to that habitat available within that bighorn's home range. And of course, again, these locations are only at midday. But what I did was I generated each bighorn's home range, and then I generated an equal number of random points within their home range to the number of observed points that we saw. And this figure here kind of just gives a sort of breakdown of that. All of the light color dots are those randomly selected locations, and the darker dots, so here the light yellow versus the dark yellow. Dark yellow would represent the actual points used by the bighorn. Maybe you can see it a little bit better in this purple over here. Anyways, we developed these different locations for a few different subsets of the data. So I looked at the subsets based on sex and then also based on those breeding seasons. And today I'm just going to present the data from all bighorn and then for ewes during lambing. And ultimately, we used a binary logistic regression that accounted for the random effect of individual to determine how use differs between these available versus used points. Or excuse me, how the habitat differed between these available versus used points. And in our resource selection function model, we used the same sort of habitat characteristics that we used originally when trying to determine if there were differences between ewe and ram locations and then differences across seasons. So I'll jump right into the results of our resource selection function model, and I'm going to begin with just the all Bighorn model. So this was all of the Bighorn locations that were taken over the past, few years. And of all the 10 predictor variables that we included in the model, all except distance to shrubland had significant coefficients. And these coefficients show whether or not the animal is selecting or avoiding that habitat characteristics. So any of the coefficients that are positive, those that are shown here in blue, are characteristics that the Bighorn are selecting, whereas those that are shown in red, those negative coefficients, are characteristics that the Bighorn are avoiding. It does get a bit more complicated than just the areas that they're selecting and avoiding, though. When we look at sort of these distance-based parameters, we have to think a little bit more about what these positive coefficients are showing. So a positive coefficient when the parameter is distance-based suggests that they're selecting areas that have large values. So in this case, they're selecting areas that have large distance to disturbance values, so areas that are far from disturbance. Whereas this negative coefficient down here for distance to woodlands suggests that they're selecting areas that have a small distance to woodland value, in other words, are close to woodlands. So just to summarize, these Bighorn are really strongly selecting areas with steep slopes that have rugged terrain. They're generally near woodlands or grasslands, and they're pretty far away from disturbance. Other parameters also seem to matter a bit. We see that they're selecting for convex curvatures. They also seem to be selecting areas of kind of relatively low elevation. One thing that's interesting is we see that they're selecting areas far from spring, which we see shift when we move on to the sheep, the ewe during lambing model. So here we're looking at that model with ewes during lambing. And again, all of the predictor variables were significant, except in this case, distance to shrubland and woodland. And here, again, we see that ewes are really selecting those steep slopes. They're selecting for areas with rugged terrain. They're selecting for areas that are far from disturbance, near grasslands. One really big difference between this and the other model is that we do see that they're selecting areas close to springs here during lambing season. This might suggest that, lactation requires maybe more water than during the rest of the year, but more sort of analysis is needed to kind of really truly understand that. And then we want to visualize this resource selection function model geospatially. So what I did was I took that coefficient from each of the different parameters and I multiplied it using the raster calculator in ArcGIS by the raster's values. So we took that beta coefficient that was given previously on that graph and multiplied it by the values within this raster. We do that for each of the different parameters and we end up adding these all together. So, first doing it with that elevation raster, then with the ruggedness raster, then with the slope raster, the disturbance raster, and ultimately any other coefficient that seemed to have a significant effect on how these animals are selecting their habitat. And eventually, when we combine this all together, we get something that looks like this, where the white values would indicate areas that would probably be used by or preferentially used by the Bighorn, and the dark areas would represent areas that aren't used by the Bighorn. I then took this resulting raster here and I extracted all the values of this raster to the points that are used by the Bighorn, as you can see here. So, we gave each of these points a different RSF value. And I then determined the range of these different RSF values in which 95 and 75% of the Bighorn locations occurred. And what we're hoping here is this would kind of help us symbolize areas of probable habitat. And this results in a pretty nice looking map. Here, this is just showing, kind of the general region with the green showing the San Andres Mountains, and all those areas that are shown in red would be considered habitats that have a high probability of Bighorn occurrence based on the parameters we used in our model. So just to conclude, I'm running short on time here. During the middle of the day, these sheep are selecting their habitats based on topographic characteristics rather than proximity to certain vegetation types or habitat disturbance or water resources. This suggests that bighorn are selecting areas that may offer protection from predators while they're resting during the hottest periods of the day. Though more work is needed to understand how these use patterns may shift during different weather conditions, we looked at different breeding seasons, but we may want to look more at how these patterns shift during the summer versus the winter. And a more thorough monitoring of resource availability and predator populations is really warranted. We can't really say that it's predators that are driving this unless we know where the predators are during the same time of the day. We also aren't super confident in our water availability data. It would be nice to get some more recent water surveys going. And although these locations just represent a small snapshot in time, they do provide some useful insights at how these bighorn may be using their habitat. And any questions, comments, or suggestions, we're open to them. I do want to shout out to Chris Lowry with USGS who helped me with this resource selection function. And here's our contact info.